Part 1. 4 years ago, Julia Gray was murdered. They never found her body. I was new to the Bay Area when she went missing, just having moved from New York. Though I will admit my family is wealthy, I insisted on making my own way. That stubbornness pushed me to buy an old sailboat that needed work, and though I was told by my sister that it was the worst decision I've ever made, when I looked at the 30-foot sailboat with a clear blue line across the side, I knew there was no coming back. I've lived on the boat since I've moved here, and I pay far less than almost anyone in the area. Around the time when I heard the news of the young woman gone missing, I started to learn how to sail. The first time was terrifying, I'll admit, as I had no idea what I was doing and my boat was not yet in proper condition. I nearly crashed into the rocks lining the marina before the luck of the wind somehow pushed me out towards the bay. If you're old enough to have learned to drive, maybe you can understand the experience. When you first operate the controls of a boat, you have no idea how it's going to tilt and turn and go. You have to just take a deep breath and see what you're really made of. I think Kurt Russell said it best. The best way to find out is to get her out on the ocean. If anything is going to happen, it's going to happen out there. Truer words were never spoken. Well, I survived my first trip on the boat. In fact, over the next few months, I did indeed learn to sail. Sometimes I would get into jams when a wind would pick up out of nowhere. Sometimes a basic failure that I couldn't yet solve would cut the engine out. But I learned as I went, and it began to seem like the wind was always on my side. It was always there to get me home. The night Julia's ghost visited me began like any other, except for the storm. My God, what a storm. Even though the harbor and breakwall around the marina are there to protect you from the weather, this night they couldn't stop what was coming. The tide was higher than I'd ever seen it, and each howl of the wind brought huge waves of dark water over the wall. I drank 2 beers hoping that I could sleep through the howling, and somehow I did. I slept for a time until something woke me up. I could feel the space was colder than before and noticed the wind had gotten even more fierce. I worried the lines holding my boat to shore had loosened in the storm as I threw my feet off the bed and opened my eyes. What I saw was horrifying. I stared through the passageway that led to the outside door and saw a figure standing in the next room over. I always left a single light on, and it brought just enough light to see her shape clearly. The hatch had been opened and her dark hair blew in the wind that the storm had brought with it. Her white dress seemed to glow in the light, yet I couldn't see her face. All I could think of was to close my bedroom door and wait it out until the morning. As luck would have it, when I opened the door the next morning, the girl was gone. But not forever. She would appear inside my boat the next 4 nights. I would try different foolish ideas like pouring a circle of salt around the boat or hanging a cross on the outside. But nothing worked, and I would see the dead girl's ghost every night. I even tried talking to her, but she never said a word. She wouldn't answer at all when I spoke to her. It almost seemed to make her more angry, actually. I stopped trying to talk to her after that. Then one night, as Julia sat on the step inside my boat, I made a mistake. When I stood up from bed and took a step closer, I accidentally shut off the lamp that I left on every night. In an instant, all light was gone from the room, and in that same moment, I heard her scream. It took me a few moments to finally locate the switch again in the blackness, but when I did, the girl was gone. Pausing for a moment, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down at my kitchen table. It made sense. From that night forward, I would make sure all the lights were off when I went to bed. And God's honest truth, Julia never came back inside. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The next day, I woke up smiling and I decided to call in sick to med school. I deserved it after all. And I felt like fishing. Maybe I'd even find a good spot. In fact, I knew the perfect spot. That morning, I motored out of the marina and into the wind. I cast both anchors, one in the front and one in the back. Pulling out my fishing rod and getting comfortable, I stared down into the water below. Julia Gray. I looked down farther into the deep blue water around me, and I swore for a moment that I saw the exact spot where I had dumped her body 4 years earlier. Yeah, this was the spot. Julia Gray. It made sense that she would be afraid of the darkness. Darkness was all she would ever see again. Part 2. I was living in New York and had just begun my first year of residency when my life changed forever. Working as a surgical resident was extremely demanding. We were on call between 60 and 80 hours a week. There was no time for a social life or any kind of life for that matter outside of work. Then one sunny Tuesday afternoon, I was eating lunch in the hospital atrium when Julia asked me if she could join me. Julia was one of those girls you don't say no to. She was smart, funny, and drop-dead gorgeous. She always had an air of flirtatious mischief about her. Julia worked as a nurse's aide, mainly in the children's cancer ward. She had this great ability to get the kids laughing. Julia joined me for lunch and we ended up talking for 2 hours, at the end of which I asked her on a date. Perhaps, she said, smiling. Then she handed me her number. I called the next day and we made our plans. It was 6 days until I had a free night, the longest 6 days of my life, and I needed to do a preoperative check on one of the patients in the children's cancer ward. Hoping to run across Julia, I surveyed the room before walking over to my patient, Clara. Clara was a very serious 8-year-old. I asked her a list of questions, then we just talked for a while. Before leaving, I asked if she was nervous about the surgery. She said no, then paused and looked me straight in the eyes. You like her, don't you? Before I could answer, she continued. She's not nice. She pretends to be nice, but she's not. Just then, I heard the door swing open and I saw Julia stride in smiling and holding a giant cluster of balloons. She tied one to each bed while she continued laughing and talking. Clara watched silently. Saturday finally arrived. I made some suggestions for plans, but Julia said she preferred spontaneity. We spent the entire day together just wandering around the city, and we both agreed that we'd never had so much fun doing nothing. Only one thing marred an otherwise perfect day. I had a dog, a golden retriever named Casey, and I told Julia that I needed to stop at my apartment to let him out. Now, ordinarily, after I walked up the 3 flights of stairs and unlocked my apartment door, I would grab the leash and Casey would race past me down to the ground floor. But today, standing in my doorway with Julia, I found Casey had stopped mid-room. He sat frozen, staring at us. I grabbed his leash and called for him, but he backed up into the kitchen and refused to budge. Julia turned her head towards me. Maybe he doesn't like strangers. I'll just wait outside, no problem. Casey didn't relax until I heard the downstairs entry door open and then shut. Looking back now, I should have known. Hindsight is 20/20, right? Our second date turned out to be our last. I had the day off, so the two of us decided to spend it hiking in the mountains. It was a beautiful day, and we had just reached the top of a climb that ended in a sheer drop of at least a few hundred feet. Without warning, Julia stepped over to the edge and looked over at me. If I jump, you jump, right? What? Julia moved forward until the tip of her shoes hung out over the edge. I grabbed her arm, but she pulled away from me, leaning out farther over the precipice. Yanking her back hard, she fell into my arms and looked up at me. "I knew you'd save me," she said. "What the hell was that?" I said, grabbing her arm and pulling her back down the path until we were far away from the edge. We barely spoke on the hike back down, and we drove back to her apartment in silence. Before going in, she looked at me seriously. "You know we're meant to be together, right?" "Julia, we hardly know each other," I replied. Slamming the car door, she walked into her house, not looking back. I had a very busy schedule and didn't see Julia again the rest of the week. Saturday night, arriving home from the late shift, I found a package waiting for me on my doorstep. The return address was from my mom. I took Casey for a quick walk, then had some dinner before sitting down to open the box. Smiling, I pulled out a squeaky toy in the shape of a squirrel and a rawhide dog bone. "It's for you, bud," I said, setting the box on the floor. After a long night, I quickly fell asleep on the couch. A short while later, I awoke to the sound of crying. Casey had thrown up on the carpet and was whining softly. I spent several minutes trying to calm him down, but his cries grew louder and more urgent. I carried him to the car and drove to the animal hospital. 2 hours later, he was dead. My mom hadn't sent any package, nor had my father or sister, and I had what was left of the rawhide bone tested for toxins. The test came back positive for rat poison. I didn't say a word the next day when I went into work at the hospital, just wanting to be left alone. I had my suspicions of who did it, but I needed more evidence. Before I could gather any, I was called into my superior's office. "Sit down, please. I think you know why we called you in here." "Actually, sir, I have no idea," I replied softly. "Well, this morning one of the other workers filed a harassment charge against you. They said you assaulted them." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I'm sorry, but we're going to have to suspend you until we finish the investigation." In a state of shock, I emptied my locker and headed down the hall. As I made my way towards the exit, I saw Julia. The entire left side of her face was covered in dark bruises. As I left the building, she gave me a smile. If this was the last thing that happened, maybe I could have found a way to go on with my life. But Julia wasn't finished with me yet. Part 3. Some people need to be killed, but make sure you plan carefully, or they might get you first. And make sure there are no witnesses. I spent a sleepless night in my empty apartment with nothing to do but think. I knew that if I could speak to my supervisor alone, I would have a better chance of telling him my side of the story. So I called and asked to come in. He said he had meetings all day, but I could come in the evening at 8 o'clock. It was Julia's day off, so there would be no chance of running into her. Thank God. Our meeting came and went, and I found myself sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot, wondering how my life had been utterly destroyed in less than a week's time. It came down to this. I had no proof while she had a face full of self-imposed bruises. I sat there in my darkened car for over an hour, trying to figure some way out of this, when I noticed a car pull in. The car looked a lot like Julia's. A woman who looked a lot like Julia got out and walked to the back door by the children's ward. She went inside. I followed. Getting inside the locked hospital without a keycard was a problem. But I knew that Carl on the janitorial staff always propped open the door in the basement stairwell to have a smoke. Lucky for me, he was a chain smoker. I offered him $50 to come with me for 10 minutes in case I needed a witness. He nodded. Quickly and quietly, we headed for the children's cancer ward. Stopping just shy of the glass double doors, we slowly looked inside. All of the children were asleep, but in the softly lit room I could see Julia standing perfectly still. She was looking down at Clara. Julia looked like she was carved in stone. She didn't even appear to be breathing. "Christ," I heard Carl whisper. "That's creepy." I was reaching forward to push open the door when Carl grabbed my arm. "No, she'll just call the cops on you. I'll do it. I can say one of the kids threw up and I have to mop the floor." I looked over at him quickly. "Okay, but go now." Standing to the side, I let Carl pass through the doors. As they spoke, I could hear Julia heading towards me, so I ducked into the closet across the hall. I listened as the soft clicking of her heels headed towards the exit and outside. Once she was out, I exited the closet and walked back into the children's ward. "Carl, can you post yourself outside the door tonight? Clara's mom gets here every morning at 7 a.m., so she'll be safe after that." "But what about tomorrow night?" Carl asked worriedly. "I think we should be okay after tomorrow. I have an idea." After saving Carl's number to my phone, I woke up Clara. I told her to tell her mom how she felt around Julia, and I asked her not to mention me. Then I left the hospital. On my way home, I stopped at a chain store and purchased a burner phone. I used it to leave an anonymous message for Clara's mom. In the message, I said that I had seen Julia, one of the nurse's aides, acting strangely around Clara. I said that she should transfer Clara to another hospital as soon as possible. I said that I feared for her safety. Carl called me the next evening. He said Clara had left the hospital with her mother by her side. Mission accomplished. Now I could concentrate on my own problems. I waited for my informal hearing, and eventually the charges against me were dropped. But I didn't want to stay in the area. I decided to move across the country and try to start over again. So I moved to San Francisco, bought an old sailboat and rented a slip in a half-deserted marina that had seen better days. I applied for and received a residency in a hospital nearby. Things seemed to be getting back on track. I even met someone. Kelly. She was genuine and kind. Everything Julia was not. I started thinking that maybe I could have a life here. I started thinking that maybe, after all, things were going to be okay. That's when my world turned upside down. That's when Kelly disappeared. She was driving to the marina for the weekend and she was an hour late. I called, no answer. Kelly was never late. After 2 hours, I got in my car and started to look for her, knowing the route she always took. Finding no sign of her en route or at her apartment, I called her parents to see if maybe there had been a family emergency. After that, I called the police. I knew they wouldn't do anything for 24 hours, but I had to do something. Somehow, I knew with absolute certainty it was Julia. I told the police everything. They called the hospital in New York and found out that 6 months ago Julia had been suspended. Shortly afterward, she quit her job. No one knew where she went. 2 days later, they found Kelly's car in a grocery store parking lot. One of the tires was flat, punctured with a sharp object. And a week later, they found Kelly. She had been hit from behind with something heavy and left to die alone in an abandoned lot. I didn't get out of bed for a week. Slowly, though, my grief turned to rage, and I knew that when Julia eventually contacted me, I was going to kill her. I didn't care about going to prison. I knew that would destroy my family, but maybe, just maybe, I could do it quietly. It wasn't even 24 hours when she called me. When I picked up the phone, I heard silence, but I knew it was her, and I was ready. "Julia, now I understand that we're meant to be together." After 30 seconds or so, I heard her speak. Do you mean that, Scott? I smiled. I do. This isn't some kind of trick, is it? She asked quietly. No trick. I don't want to be alone anymore, and I need to see you. But I'm already here, she replied calmly. Surprised, I looked up towards the gate to the marina and saw Julia standing with a phone to her ear on the other side. I hadn't expected her this soon. Pausing, then walking over quickly, I opened the gate as we both stood in front of each other. Then she threw her arms around me and I pulled her close. That night we sailed out into the delta, dropped anchor, and cooked dinner together. We were going to have a fillet with potatoes and red wine. Everything had to be perfect for our first night back together. We sat down on the deck of the boat and she took my hand in hers. I'm so glad you came to your senses, Julia said, kissing me. We watched the sun as it fell down slowly behind the mountains. The water was almost dark now as I poured us both a glass of red wine. Minutes passed, and as I went to stand up to put the dishes away, I almost fell over. But it wasn't from the wine. I had only had one glass. She had drugged me, I realized, as I lost my balance and fell back onto the deck. I'm sorry, Scott. It's just, I can't believe you anymore. I promise I'll make it quick. I stared up at Julia. She had beaten me. Or so she thought. Before I passed out, I managed to say one last thing. Hey, Julia. Did you really think you could kill my girlfriend and my dog, and I was just gonna let it go? Before I passed out, I watched as a look of betrayal and surprise fell across her face. Julia slumped forward and slid to the floor. Darkness fell over me. When I awoke, I was greeted to the image of Julia trying to drag herself towards the knife rack inside my boat. I was groggy still, but I was in a stronger state than she was. Walking up behind her quietly, I picked up a large metal flashlight on my counter, and I slammed it down on her head. She passed out again. When she awoke this time, she was seated upright on the edge of the boat. There were chains around her arms, neck, and back. I smiled as she looked from the chains to the block of concrete they were wrapped around. The concrete was teetering on the edge. I watched the emotion on her face as I sat across from her. Sleep well, Julia. Before she could speak, I kicked the concrete block over the edge and watched the chains pull her body down into the darkness. She didn't even have time to scream. I watched until she disappeared into the darkness completely.